$200. That was the sum Arthur Vance had wired to a broker in San Francisco, a man who promised a wife, a partner to help him hold onto his homestead claim. It was every last coin he had, scraped from the sale of 2 good horses and the last of his father's savings. But as the midday stage from Carson City kicked up a column of dust on the horizon, a cold dread settled in his gut. He had paid for a stranger, sight unseen, based on a single line in a telegraph, healthy woman, 18, obedient. Arrives Tuesday, he had pictured someone sturdy, weathered, prepared for the hard-scrabble life of the Nevada scrubland in 1878. The stage groaned to a halt. The driver tossed down a mailbag. Then the door swung open. A girl stepped down, not a woman. She was small, fine-boned, and swallowed by a plain, dark green prairie dress that looked like it had been made for someone else. Her black hair was pulled back severely, making her face seem pale and stark against the bleached summer sun. She held a single, small cloth bundle. This was my. She looked around, her eyes taking in the dusty street, the clapboard storefronts of Prairie Ridge, and finally, Arthur. There was no fear in her gaze, only a deep, unnerving stillness. Arthur's heart sank. He needed a partner to help him fight Sterling Blackwood, the cattle baron who was slowly strangling his ranch by choking off Vance Creek. He needed a fighter, a worker. What he had gotten was a child who looked like a strong wind could carry her off. He stepped forward, his own boots feeling heavy and clumsy. "You are my," he asked, the words rough in his throat. She gave a short, sharp nod. Her eyes met his for a moment, and he saw they were not the eyes of a child. They were old, watchful, and held a story he couldn't begin to read. He had gambled his entire future on this slip of a girl. And as he looked at her, standing there in the brutal Nevada sun, he was terrifyingly certain he had lost. Arthur led her to his wagon without another word. The ride to the homestead was a silent, suffocating affair, punctuated only by the creak of the wheels and the buzz of horseflies. The land stretched out around them, a study in brown and gray, the heat shimmering off the hard-baked earth. He pointed out the boundaries of his property, the low rise of hills to the west, the thin, pathetic trickle of what was left of Vance Creek to the east. "That's it," he said, his voice flat. "The Vance Creek homestead." She looked at the dry creek bed, her gaze lingering there longer than it did on the small, unpainted cabin or the struggling corral. She said nothing. When they arrived, he helped her down and carried her small bundle inside. The cabin was one room, clean but stark. A bed in one corner, a stone hearth for cooking, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. It was the home of a man who had given up on comfort long ago. "The pantry is here," he said, gesturing to a small cupboard. He opened it, and the sight of its contents was a fresh wave of shame. A half-empty sack of flour, a tin of coffee, a side of salt pork, a basket of dusty potatoes, and a few jars of his mother's old preserves. Not enough. It was never enough. Mai looked at the meager supplies, her expression unreadable. She ran a delicate finger over the rough wood of the shelf, then turned to face him. "I cook," she said. Her voice was quiet, the English words carefully formed. Arthur just nodded, a hollow feeling in his chest. "Yes. That's the arrangement." He felt like a fraud. He had brought her here under the pretense of marriage, of building a life, when in reality he had bought a body to satisfy the Homestead Act's requirement of a family on the land. He was using her to fight a battle she didn't know she was in. The next afternoon, the battle came to them. 3 riders crested the ridge, their silhouettes dark against the glaring sky. Arthur recognized the lead rider instantly. Sterling Blackwood. He was a man built on a large scale, with a booming voice and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. He ran his massive cattle operation with an iron fist, buying out or crushing any smaller rancher who got in his way. Arthur met them in the yard, his hand resting near the axe handle propped against the cabin wall. "Blackwood," he said, his tone even. "Vance," Blackwood boomed, dismounting with the easy grace of a man who owned the ground he stood on. "Just a neighborly visit." "Heard you had an arrival on the stage." His eyes slid past Arthur to the cabin door, where Mai had appeared, a silent figure in her green dress. Blackwood's smile widened, a predatory thing. "Well, I'll be a little china doll. Getting civilized out here, are we?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "This is my wife, Mai." Blackwood tipped his hat with theatrical courtesy. He turned back to Arthur, his voice dropping to a confidential, conspiratorial tone. "Look, Vance, I'm having a small gathering at my place. Saturday night. A supper to celebrate the expansion of the territory. I've got some important folks coming down from the capital, including Judge Albright. He's the man who signs off on the final land patents." The threat was unspoken but perfectly clear. "I'd consider it a personal favor if you and your bride would join us." It wasn't an invitation, it was a summons. A public stage for Arthur's surrender. If he refused, Blackwood would paint him as antisocial, uncooperative. If he accepted, he would be a guest in the court of the king who was about to execute him. He would have to sit there, a poor homesteader with his foreign wife, and listen as Blackwood announced his plans to consolidate the valley, plans that included the damming of Vance Creek and the death of Arthur's ranch. "We'll be there," Arthur heard himself say. The words tasted like ash. Blackwood clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture of false friendship that was heavy with ownership. "Excellent. Knew you were a sensible man." His gaze flickered back to Mai, a dismissive, pitying glance. Then he and his men mounted up and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and failure hanging in the air. Arthur stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle. He felt the last of his hope draining away into the parched soil. He was walking into the lion's den, and he didn't even have the strength to roar. He turned and saw Mai standing in the doorway, her small bundle now open on the table. She had laid out a few items, a change of clothes, a small comb, and a tightly wrapped silk pouch. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he thought he saw a flicker of something other than stillness in them. It looked like resolve. What he did not know yet was that Judge Albright was a man who had spent years in San Francisco, a man with a discerning palate who was tired of the monotonous, greasy fare of the frontier. He was a man who could be swayed by things other than land deeds and legal arguments. The supper at Blackwood's was more than a public humiliation, it was an arena, and Arthur had no idea that his new wife had just brought a weapon he could never have imagined. That night, sleep offered Arthur no escape. He tossed in his bed, the image of Blackwood's condescending smile burned into his mind. The man wasn't just taking his land, he was taking his dignity, piece by piece, and forcing him to watch. He finally gave up on rest and rose, pulling on his trousers. The moon was high, casting a pale, ghostly light across the cabin floor. A faint, rhythmic sound drew him toward the hearth. Mai was there, kneeling on the cool stone. In the moonlight, her green dress looked almost black. She had a small, smooth stone bowl, no bigger than his palm, and she was grinding something in it with a pestle. A faint, unfamiliar scent hung in the air, a mix of earth and spice and something else he couldn't name. It was the silk pouch from her bundle, now untied, revealing a collection of dried seeds, roots, and leaves. He watched her for a moment, her movements precise and economical. There was a deep concentration in the set of her shoulders, in the steady motion of her hands. This was not a chore, it was a craft. "What is that?" he asked, his voice low so as not to startle her. She looked up, her face shadowed. She held up the pestle, showing him the fine powder collecting in the bowl. "From my father," she said. "He cook for railroad men. Big men." The words were simple, but they landed with the weight of a revelation. She wasn't just a farmer's daughter from a distant province. Her father had been a cook, and not just any cook. He had worked for the magnates building the great iron roads across the country, men with wealth and power and demanding tastes. She hadn't just watched him, she had learned. The careful way she handled the spices, the focused intent in her eyes, it all made sense. Arthur moved closer and sat at the table. He felt a sudden, desperate need to make her understand. "Mai," he began, searching for the words. "Blackwood, the man from today. He is not a friend. He wants this land. He has stopped the water from the creek. He gestured helplessly toward the dry fields outside. That supper, it is not a party. It is for him to show everyone he has won. To show the judge, the important man, that I am nothing. That this place is nothing. He finally said the words that had been strangling him. I am going to lose everything. Mai finished her grinding. She carefully tipped the fragrant powder into a small twist of paper and folded it shut. She stood and walked to the pantry, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She took out the side of salt pork, a piece of tough, stringy beef he'd been saving, and a handful of wild onions he'd gathered. She placed them on the table before him. She looked him straight in the eye. The stillness was gone, replaced by a fierce, burning intensity. She tapped the meat with one finger. Then she tapped her chest. My father, she said again, her voice clear and strong. He make kings from nothing. For the first time since she'd arrived, Arthur felt a flicker of something other than despair. It was a wild, improbable hope, as thin and fragile as a spider's thread, but it was there. He was a man drowning, and this quiet girl had just offered him a strange and unbelievable lifeline. He made a choice. He would not go to Blackwood's supper as a beggar. He would not go to witness his own execution. He would trust her. All right, he said, his voice husky. Show them. Show them all. The day of the supper arrived with a blistering sun that bleached the sky to a pale, hazy white. Arthur hitched his best horse, the one he hadn't sold, to the wagon. Mai emerged from the cabin carrying a large cast-iron pot, covered with a damp cloth. The pot was heavy, and the smell that wafted from it was rich and complex, a world away from the simple scent of roasting meat or boiling potatoes. It smelled of the earth, of fire, and of the strange, potent spices she had ground by moonlight. The ride to Blackwood's ranch was tense. Arthur felt the eyes of his neighbors as they passed smaller homesteads. They were all headed to the same place, all part of Blackwood's audience. He saw the pity and the resignation in their faces. They knew what this was about. Blackwood's ranch was a fortress. A sprawling main house built of thick timber, surrounded by the largest corrals Arthur had ever seen. Dozens of horses were tied to the rails, and the yard buzzed with the talk and laughter of nearly everyone who mattered in the valley. As Arthur helped Mai down from the wagon, a hush fell over the nearest group of men. All eyes went to her, then to the heavy pot she carried. Blackwood strode out onto the porch, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Vance! Glad you could make it. His eyes fell on the pot, and a look of amused contempt crossed his face. Bringing your own supper? Times that tough, are they? A few of his men snickered. Arthur felt a hot flush of anger, but he kept his voice steady. A gift for your table, Blackwood. A custom from my wife's home. Blackwood waved a dismissive hand. Take it to the kitchen. The women will find a place for it. But Mai did not move toward the kitchen. She walked directly to the long trestle table set up in the yard, laden with enormous platters of food. It was a display of brute force wealth, whole roasted pigs, mountains of beef, bowls of greasy beans, and stacks of dry cornbread. She found a small space among the platters and set down her pot. With a calm deliberation, she removed the cloth. A cloud of fragrant steam rose into the hot evening air. The aroma, so potent and unique, cut through the mundane smells of roasted meat and wood smoke. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. The scent was magnetic, drawing people closer. It was a savory, complex perfume that spoke of patience and skill. Judge Albright, a portly man with a weary face and expensive city clothes, was standing near the porch talking to Blackwood. He paused mid-sentence, his nose twitching. What is that aroma? He asked, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet. Blackwood scowled. Just something the homesteader's new wife brought. The judge ignored him. He walked over to the table, his eyes fixed on the pot. Inside was a stew, the meat a deep, rich brown, braised until it was falling apart. The gravy was thick and glossy, studded with softened onions and flecks of green herbs. It looked nothing like the other food on the table. It looked like art. Mai stood beside her pot, her hands clasped before her, her face serene. The judge picked up a plate and a spoon. He served himself a small portion. The whole yard seemed to be holding its breath, watching him. He brought the spoon to his lips, tasted, and then closed his eyes. A slow smile spread across his tired face. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated pleasure. "My word," he murmured, loud enough for those nearby to hear. He took another, larger bite. Incredible, he looked up, his eyes searching the crowd until they found Arthur. "Vance, is it? You must introduce me to the artist." Arthur led the judge over to my. "Judge Albright, this is my wife, my." The judge bowed his head slightly to her, a gesture of genuine respect. "Madam," he said, "I have eaten at the finest restaurants in San Francisco. I have not tasted anything this remarkable in years. You have transformed this tough range beef into something sublime." Mai gave a small, graceful nod of her head. "Thank you." The dam had broken. A line formed at the table, everyone eager to try the dish that had captivated the judge. Soon, Blackwood's massive platters were ignored, while people scraped the last bits from Mai's iron pot. The conversation shifted. It was no longer about Blackwood's land acquisitions or his prize bulls. It was about the homesteader's wife and her astonishing cooking. Blackwood's face was a thundercloud. He had orchestrated this entire evening to showcase his power, to cement his dominance. Instead, a quiet Chinese girl in a plain green dress had stolen his entire audience with a single pot of stew. She had done more than cook a meal, she had changed the entire narrative of the evening. She had shown that value didn't just come from acreage and head of cattle. It could come from skill, from refinement, from turning something common into something extraordinary. Later, as the evening wound down, Judge Albright sought Arthur out. They stood by the corral fence, away from the crowd. "Your wife is a remarkable woman," the judge said, lighting a cigar. "Yes, sir. She is." The judge took a long draw from his cigar, studying Arthur in the fading light. A man with a wife like that, with a home that can produce something of that quality, is not the sort of man who just gives up. "Blackwood mentioned you were having some trouble with your water rights." Here it was. The opening. Arthur took a breath and told him everything. He spoke of the dam, the dwindling creek, the way Blackwood had been pressuring him and the other small ranchers for months. He spoke not with the desperation of a victim, but with the quiet confidence of a man who had something worth fighting for. The judge listened, his expression thoughtful. "Diverting a natural waterway for personal gain without a territorial patent is a serious matter," he said finally. "I believe I'll need to review the Vance Creek surveys myself when I return to the capital. Personally." He looked over at Blackwood, who was watching them from the porch with a look of pure fury. The judge gave Arthur a knowing look. Some men think power is about being the loudest voice in the room. Sometimes, it's about serving the best meal. 6 months later, the first snows of winter dusted the high peaks. The water in Vance Creek ran full and clear, sparkling in the cold sun. Judge Albright had been true to his word. An injunction had come down from the territorial capital, forcing Blackwood to dismantle his illegal dam. His power in the valley had been checked, his aura of invincibility shattered. The Vance Creek homestead was transformed. News of Mai's cooking had spread. Twice a month, Arthur would drive her into Prairie Ridge, where she would cook for the town council or cater a wedding. They were small jobs, but the money was steady. With it, they had bought 2 dairy cows, a flock of chickens, and repaired the roof of the cabin. The pantry was full now, shelves lined with jars of preserves and sacks of grain. The home was no longer stark, it was alive. One evening, Arthur sat at the table while Mai prepared their supper. The air was warm and smelled of baking bread. He watched her move about the small room, her steps light and sure. She was no longer just the stranger in the green dress, the desperate gamble he had taken. She was his partner. She had saved him, not with a rifle or a picket line, but with a skill he never could have imagined. She had fought Blackwood on a battlefield of her own choosing and won a total victory. She placed a bowl of steaming soup and a thick slice of bread in front of him. It was a simple meal, nothing like the masterpiece she had created for Blackwood's party, but it was filled with the same care, the same quiet artistry. He looked across the table at her, at the woman he had bought for $200. It was the best and most important money he had ever spent. He had sent for a homesteader, a body to fill a legal loophole. But what had arrived was a future, a home, a life far richer than any herd of cattle or expanse of land could ever provide. Some men built their legacies on what they could take from the world. He was learning, slowly, that a better one could be built on what you could create together. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.